This is one of the most special chapters in the Bible for me, and it's not just because it's about faith. We get to see very practical examples through some of these heroes in the Bible around faith and how they applied it. So I thought we'd get started with a little bit of a humor and learning what faith is from the voices of children.
Okay, guys, what is faith?
Faith is, it's kind of like a, could you hold the camera? I just need to think. Faith. Faith. God?
Faith is not fun. Faith is when you have courage to do something and you do it and you believe you can do it.
If you think that you can't do something, but then you believe that you can do it.
Is when you believe something before you see it.
And you're obeying God. Is that right? Or is that the wrong answer?
Faith is believing without seeing.
You can feel it and you can see it in your head before you see it.
Believing that something's going to happen and trusting God.
Faith is believing in something that you cannot see, feel, or have any way of seeing it. Well, you can actually see it, but you can see it. Having faith is like seeing it in the future.
I think some of those answers, I have to laugh at, I think the boy's name was Tyler. Actually, you missed it because the audio was down, but he asked at one point for him to put down the camera while he thinks a little bit more about what faith is. So sometimes we kind of feel like the boy Tyler, but ultimately, how would you answer what faith is? It's taken me a long time, 50 years, to really, truly understand what faith is. And, my idea of faith and what we see as we study Hebrews 11, I think there's some really important things that come out here. So let's go ahead and get started with, I'm going to cover just the first two verses in Hebrews to start with. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. For it, by the people of old, received their commendation. So we're going to cover the people of old because that's really where we start seeing Abel. We see Gideon, we see Samuel, we see David and many other biblical heroes. But it says faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And that's a pretty specific definition. I went to Webster's dictionary and kind of looked at what did they say what faith is. There's two descriptions here: complete trust or confidence in someone or something. That's pretty good. And then number two, a strong belief in God or in the doctrines of religion based on spiritual apprehension rather than proof. I don't really like the word apprehension per se. I really appreciate number one here. But I think there's three words that we really need to come to grips with as we open up God's word in Hebrews 11. And they are the words hope, belief, and faith. Is there a difference between these three words? What do you think? There is. I will tell you that if I were to draw a Venn diagram of hope, belief, and faith, there's an intersection there. But let me try and make an attempt at defining what these three words mean. Well, hope, an optimistic attitude of mind based on an expectation or a desire. Does that make sense? A belief, trust or confidence in someone or something. And I added this, because I think this is really kind of the crux of, as I had my aha moment between belief, faith, and hope, is that it's a belief is a product of the mind. We'll substitute the word knowledge there for a moment. Faith, complete trust in a person or thing or a belief not based off of proof. And then I added this, faith is the product of the heart. So I think the best illustration that I can give you between belief, faith, and hope is pretty much how I kind of lived for the last 28 years, many, many times on an airplane. And, if I sit and I start researching, what it means to fly on an airplane, well, I know that there's over 44,000 flights every day around the world of airplane taking off and then landing. I also know that 2.7 million people fly each and every day. And I know that pilots do a tremendous amount of studying and preparing to be a pilot. 5,000 hours of training at least, lots of flight simulators, and years of study. So that knowledge that I have of all those different facts is important, but that's not faith. If I tell you what faith is, it's buying your ticket, sitting in your seat, and trusting the pilot will land that plane successfully. Do you see the difference? On the left with belief, we're talking about knowledge, things of the mind. But faith is really around letting go, letting God take control of that wheel, and trusting that God will take us where he wants us to go. And then hope is, and I hoped many times when I was flying around the world, that I get upgraded to first class. So the question is do we accept facts as truth, or are we trusting someone else with our destiny? And that's really, as I went through this journey that I've been on around understanding faith, this was kind of the aha moment for myself, is letting go, God is in control. I used this analogy before, is that, me being a pretty conservative person, imagine there's a river running through, and there's stepping stones across that river. And I'd always want to take one step, get my foot firmly on that rock, and then take that next step where I see that path. That, my friends, is not faith. And so as we start going ahead, I want to look at Hebrews 11:3, because this is one that's just completely mind-blowing to me. One verse, but given my interest in science, I think you'll understand why. It says in verse 3, "By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made of things that are visible." I love astronomy. And have you ever been out to the telescope on the park? You enjoy that? Oh, I tell you what, they're going to be open. It's a wonderful thing to do. It's rather late at night, but I remember for the first time seeing Saturn, out there, and it was a beautiful, beautiful sight. But as you start studying astronomy and realizing the vastness that is the universe, as it's spoken in verse 3 here, it is so humbling. You feel so insignificant. But there's a wonderful promise that I want to share with you tied to this. So back in the 1970s, I think a lot of you know that I spent 28 years working for IBM, is that in 1977, they initiated a video to be created called The Power of 10. Really fascinating. I'm not going to take you through the whole video, but what they do is they start in Chicago with a couple sitting in a park, and every few seconds they go up a power of 10. And you see just with a few iterations, you're now into the universe, past our solar system. And again, it's really humbling to think about the vastness of what God created in Genesis 1:1. I apologize for the sound. This was 1977.
The picnic near the lakeside in Chicago is the start of a lazy afternoon, early one October. We begin with a scene 1 meter wide, which we view from just 1 meter away. Now, every 10 seconds, we will look from 10 times farther away, and our field of view will be 10 times wider. This square is 10 meters wide, and in 10 seconds, the next square will be 10 times as wide. Our picture will center on the picnickers, even after they've been lost to sight. 100 meters wide. The distance a man can run in 10 seconds. Cars crowd the highway. Power boats lie at their docks. The colorful bleachers are Soldiers Field. This square is a kilometer wide, 1,000 meters. The distance a racing car can travel in 10 seconds. We see the great city on the lake shore. 10 to the 4th meters, 10 kilometers. The distance a supersonic airplane can travel in 10 seconds. We see first the rounded end of Lake Michigan, then the whole Great Lake. 10 to the 5th meters, the distance an orbiting satellite covers in 10 seconds. Long parades of clouds, the day's weather in the Middle West. 10 to the 6th, a 1 with 6 zeros, 1,000,000 meters. Soon the Earth will show as a solid sphere. We are able to see the whole Earth now, just over a minute along the journey. The Earth diminishes into the distance, but those background stars are so much farther away that they do not yet appear to move. A line extends at the true speed of light. In 1 second, it half crosses the tilted orbit of the moon. Now we mark a small part of the path in which the Earth moves about the sun. Now the orbital paths of the neighbor planets, Venus and Mars, then Mercury. Entering our field of view is the glowing center of our solar system, the sun, followed by the massive outer planets, swinging wide in their big orbits. That odd orbit belongs to Pluto. A fringe of a myriad comets too faint to see completes the solar system. Ten to the 14th. As the solar system shrinks to one bright point in the distance, our sun is plainly now only one among the stars. Looking back from here, we note 4 southern constellations, still much as they appear from the far side of the Earth. This square is 10 to the 16th meters, 1 light year, not yet out to the next star. Our last 10-second step took us 10 light years further. The next will be 100. Our perspective changes so much in each step now that even the background stars will appear to converge. At last, we pass the bright star Arcturus and some stars of the Dipper. Normal but quite unfamiliar stars and clouds of gas surround us as we traverse the Milky Way galaxy. Giant steps carry us into the outskirts of the galaxy. And as we pull away, we begin to see the great flat spiral facing us. The time and path we chose to leave Chicago has brought us out of the galaxy along a course nearly perpendicular to its disk. The 2 little satellite galaxies of our own are the Clouds of Magellan. 10 to the 22nd power, 1,000,000 light years. Groups of galaxies bring a new level of structure to the scene. Glowing points are no longer single stars, but whole galaxies of stars seen as one. We pass the big Virgo cluster of galaxies among many others, 100 million light years out. As we approach the limit of our vision, we pause to start back home. This lonely scene, the galaxies like dust, is what most of space looks like. This emptiness is normal. The richness of our own neighborhood is the exception. The trip back to the picnic on the lakefront will be a sped-up version, reducing the distance to the Earth's surface by 1 power of 10 every 2 seconds. In each 2 seconds, we will appear to cover 90% of the remaining distance back to Earth. Notice the alternation between great activity and relative inactivity, a rhythm that will continue all the way into our next goal, a proton in the nucleus of a carbon atom beneath the skin on the hand of the sleeping man at the picnic. Ten to the 9th meters, 10 to the 8th, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are back at our starting point. We slow up at 1 meter, 10 to the 0 power. Now we reduce the distance to our final destination by 90% every 10 seconds, each step much smaller than the one before. At 10 to the minus 2, 1/100th of a meter, 1 centimeter, we approach the surface of the hand. In a few seconds, we'll be entering the skin, crossing layer after layer from the outermost dead cells into a tiny blood vessel within. Skin layers vanish in turn. An outer layer of cells, felty collagen. The capillary containing red blood cells and a roughly lymphocyte. We enter the white cell. Among its vital organelles, the porous wall of the cell nucleus appears. The nucleus...
And it says, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. So imagine you are Abel, and later on, Cain kills Abel as the first murder. How do you think, Abel felt as he sacrificed a lamb? Has that been very difficult for him to do? Sure. Absolutely. And so by faith, trusting in what God has commanded him to do, we see a marked difference. You think about what Cain did. What did he actually sacrifice? Vegetables. What was the significance and meaning of sacrificing vegetables?
No shedding of blood.
No shedding of blood. And what is the significance of shedding blood?
Without blood, there's no forgiveness.
Exactly right. And this is why we talked about in last chapter, the game-changing event of what Christ did in terms of dying on the cross, and what it means for you and I. So let's continue on, and we're going to look at Hebrews 11, verses 5 through 6. By faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever shall draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So what do we know about Enoch? There's one really important thing that we know. He walked with God and... Right, he was taken to God. Now, what was the world like? And this is a really important, when we think about the faith of Enoch, walking with God in of itself sounds like a very precious, precious relationship, doesn't it? But what was the world like when Enoch lived? It was getting bad. In fact, I had to look at this, I put together a genealogy from Adam to Noah here. And you can see that if you look at this timeline here, Adam's at the top, we go to Seth, Enosh, Canaan, and eventually you get to Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. So we know what the times were when it came to Noah's timeline, right? It was so bad that God wanted to what? He regretted ever made man. Very, very significant, very sad. So the world in which Enoch lived, and you can see he lived here on this earth for 365 years, was right in the middle of all of that. So the world conditions were pretty poor. Now, I was thinking about this. He had this special walk with God. What excuses might any of us have in not living and walking that faith with God? There's a lot of distractions, aren't there? There's peer pressure. There's many, many things that kind of factor into excuses, and they are excuses when we choose not to live in faith with God. And that is, I think, a wonderful illustration as we look at the life of Enoch in terms of that walking with God and that special tight relationship through faith. And it's really difficult. We're going to talk about peer pressure in a moment. But imagine the peer pressure if you're the only one or of a subset that's doing something. What do you think the other people react? You're going to make fun, ridicule? Is that a pleasant environment to be around? No. So as we look at Hebrews 11 verses 7, this takes us now into Noah. By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. So when I think of Noah, I think of scenes like this, constructing the ark. You see sunshine and everyone's working happily. But I was looking at patriarchs and prophets this afternoon, and let me read this for you. Many at first appeared to receive the warning, so they're talking about the people. Yet they did not turn to God with true repentance. They were unwilling to renounce their sins. During the time that elapsed before the coming of the flood, their faith was tested, and they failed to endure the trial. Overcome by the prevailing unbelief, they finally joined their former associates in rejecting the solemn message. Some were deeply convicted, and would have heeded the words of warning, but there were so many to jest and ridicule that they partook of the same spirit, resisted the invitations of mercy, and were soon among the boldest and most defiant scoffers. For none are so reckless and go to such lengths to sin as do those who have once had light but have resisted the convicting Spirit of God. Ouch. Do you remember Uncle Dan and Aunt Sue, the Bible stories? I grew up on those. In fact, I think we still have the cassette tapes somewhere. But I think one of my favorite stories was in Genesis and the story of Noah. And I just remember the actors really bringing to light this point around scoffing, jesting, and ridiculing. So if I go and show you that picture again of building this, very large ark, where there are a lot of things from their point of view to laugh at. Yes. Yes.
I was just thinking, people too were pointing out, hey, when you talk about rain, what is rain?
What is rain?
Rain form.
Yeah.
Okay, the same situation versus now down to our day. The Lord's going to come in the clouds of heaven. Well, when is this event going to happen? I was reading the other morning an article written by Mr. Twain in 1875 or 79 really, and it's been 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And so, and basically she's saying, get ready, the Lord is coming.
Yeah. And Jesus spoke exactly about that.
We're still facing the same thing in a way that those people before the flood, the ridicule that they accepted, hey, where's the rain? Where's this coming?
Yes. You're exactly right. The parallels, and Jesus even speaks about this as in the days of Noah. So the parallels between what happened in the life of Noah leading up to the flood, and then we kind of look at the second coming of Christ, the last days, the same exact behavior. And this really is an important point because I do worry very significantly about our younger generation because I tell you what, I remember going through grade school and high school and there was, classes and people I didn't necessarily like, but the outright bullying that we see is just so different than when I grew up. And I don't know how it was as you went to school in those days, but I just went and did a search here about how do we handle ridicule. How do we handle ridicule? Do we handle it well? Do we cave into it? Who is it coming from? Yeah. Well, I did a Google search on the search term is how do you handle ridicule, and there's 6.8 million hits on handle ridicule. But ridicule is not really a common word these days. So how do you handle bullying? And there's over 27 million things. So as we think about the last days, and you're exactly right, brother, that the people didn't know what rain was. And so they see this giant boat being created and laughing and ridiculing. The animals come in, which would have been a big warning sign for me that there's some divine intervention here. The door closes, 7 days. And so as we think about those last days, I have the exact same worries in terms of exactly what Noah went through in those last times leading up to the flood. We are rinsing and repeating that in a much grander scale as we get to the last days before Christ comes. And I just worry about that fortitude and how do you handle bullying? How do you handle ridicule? And I think it goes back to that relationship and walking with God. So Hebrews 8, verses 8 through 12. Now we're getting into Abraham. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. And then it goes on to say in verse 11, by faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past that age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. And I always love the word therefore. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. So we just kind of covered two scenes in the life of Abraham and the life of Abraham and Sarah. The first one was leaving what? His home. And the second one was the birth of Isaac. Now I think about the leaving home for a bit here. And when you leave and go into the unknown, it is frightening, is it not? I'll give you some stories, but it is very frightening when you leave what you're comfortable and you have grown up, and going into the unknown is absolutely frightening. But what I have seen, and what's the saying, hindsight is always 20/20. Looking back on those times in my life where I went into the unknown and looking back, there's a lot of things that I actually learned and appreciated. So this particular saying here, going into the unknown is invariably frightening, but we learn what is significantly new only through adventures or going into that unknown. So I remember very vividly, this is not a picture that I took, but the very, very first trip that I took to China, I was a bit younger and a little less gray, but I remember vividly landing into the Shanghai airport, and this is not the new modern airport, this was one like right down in the city. And I remember walking out after getting through immigration and customs, and this kind of captures the image in that I was looking around all these different buildings, and that's what I was looking at. I felt an apple in a sea of oranges. There's a lot of different analogies I can use there. And I will never forget this. I thought this was rather insulting at the time, but there was someone that was trying to help me into a taxi, and he only knew 3 words, and they were, "You, Larry Bird." He thought I was Larry Bird. Tall person like myself. And I don't know about you, I don't find Larry Bird the most attractive individual out there. But he thought I was Larry Bird. I was like, where am I? How am I going to get by? Fast forward, 10 or 12 trips to China, it is one of the most rewarding things to start appreciating the culture and the things that I'm learning from them. But I tell you what, this picture right here, me by myself, I was absolutely frightened. But now that hindsight, that perspective is so telling. There's also, I think, an important point around lost in translation. And I see this all the time. These are just a few signs that you see in terms of translation between English and Chinese. Please present your octopus. I'm sorry, I forgot to bring my octopus. I love this one, which is about putting your trash in the spot. It says poisonous and evil rubbish, which is probably true. And I don't know about this food, but it says explodes the large intestine. So, looking at it, and I want to get serious for a moment and look back to, Abram as he's about to leave his home, absolutely frightening. But he trusted in where God was doing. God, you are in control. Take the wheel. All those analogies are so very important that we see through the life of Abram. Now let's look at the second image that we saw in this verse. And it has to do with God promising your descendants will be as what? The stars in the sky? The sand? How old was Abraham and Sarah when she gave birth? Yeah, exactly right. Sarah was 90, and Abraham was a little bit older. And I go back, remember we read this verse, this in verse 12, therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven. So God's promise was absolutely true. But if you look at it from a human point of view, and remember what Psalms 90 says around the lifespan of a man? 70. Exactly. And how old was Sarah? Was she older than that age? So given that Abraham was well past the average human lifespan, he was as good as dead from a worldly perspective. Praise the Lord, we don't live with worldly perspectives. So now let's look at verses 13 through 16. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles in the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of what land from which they had gone out, they would have an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared them a city. So there's a couple of things that really, if I were to highlight, these are things that I would highlight. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. You realize as we study these heroes of faith, did they actually receive everything that God promised while they were here in this life? In many cases, no. And this is a really important perspective that I think we have to understand, is that they saw them and welcomed them from a distance. I know that every one of us here in this room are yearning for that day when Christ comes. But we have this promise, we have this faith, and we see and we're going to welcome that, even though we may not see this here in our lifetime. Now, the best analogy that I can give, and I apologize, I love analogies, but it helps me understand things, is I think you guys know I am a football fan. I was really happy this Sunday with the Dallas Cowboys. But the best analogy I can give around this is, as much as I love football, I absolutely dislike preseason football. Why is that? It's not competitive. Are they trying? You don't even see some teams don't even sit their key players. And I find those games really, really boring. But what happens when the real game starts? You get serious. They count. That's beautiful. They are significant in terms of their meaning. So follow this analogy here. As unsatisfying as preseason football is, we know sitting there in August in game 2 that is really boring and I'm falling asleep, which I never do during football, we know there is something better when the game really starts. We know there is something better in the distance. The analogy is I still feel we are in preseason and we are yearning when the real season starts. So now let's move forward and look at verses 17 through 19. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was even able to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So this is kind of one of the iconic, there's lots of pictures and paintings, but this is a very iconic picture in my mind in terms of Abraham about to sacrifice Isaac. Now, this also speaks volumes around the walk that Abraham had with God. And again, I went back to Patriarchs and Prophets, And it says, even now, he did not murmur against God, but strengthened his soul by dwelling upon the evidences of the Lord's goodness and faithfulness. This son had been unexpectedly given, and had not he who had bestowed the precious gift a right to recall his own. Then faith repeated the promise, in Isaac shall thy seed be called, a seed numberless as the grains of sand upon the shore. Isaac was the child of a miracle, and could not the power that gave him life restore it? Looking beyond that which was seen, Abraham grasped the divine word, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. What amazing faith. You know, if I were to put myself in that position of sacrificing one of my children, it's something I just cannot comprehend. And then I look at what Abraham did, and he had the promise from God that his descendants would be like the sands or the stars in the sky. And he believed that even if Isaac were sacrificed, God would raise him up. Willingly lie down there. Absolutely. I can't comprehend that really either. So now we're going to get into, kind of moving forward, we're going to get into Isaac and then Esau and Jacob. Verse 20. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. And in fact, as we look at Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, which are the three next ones, there's something in common with all three of them, that Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph were kind of at their last, at their deathbed, kind of giving blessings and those kind of things. So they're all kind of in the same state of mind. But I think about this as I go back to this scene right here of Isaac blessing Jacob and Esau. Do you feel sorry at all for Esau in terms of how things were kind of tricked and taken away from him? I do too. I went back and I read and I have the two blessings that Isaac bestowed on Jacob and Esau. And just look and compare the difference between the two. It says, from the dew of heaven and the richness of earth, may God always give you abundant harvests of grain and bountiful new wine. May many nations become your servants. May they bow down to you. May you be the master over your brothers. And may your mother's son bow down to you. All who curse you will be cursed. All who bless you will be blessed. Is that a pretty good blessing? Yes. Now let's look at Esau's blessing here. Yeah, absolutely.
He knew that the blessing was supposed to go to Jacob, but because of his biasness, he figured that he was going to go against God, according to what they were going to say.
Yes.
And so, when God says something, it's going to happen.
Regardless of how we try and intervene. Yes, absolutely. So on Esau's blessings, you will live away from the richness of the earth and away from the dew of the heaven above. You will live by your sword, and you will serve your brother, but when you decide to break free, you will shake the yoke from your neck. So kind of compare and contrast. But what is, I think, really heartwarming to me is if you fast forward, where did Esau and Jacob's life kind of meet many years later? You remember that? Remember Jacob wrestling with an angel? And how did Esau treat Jacob when they actually reunited?
He had a dream
Yeah.
that changed his perspective or his attitude. He was coming back for a fight. But the dream told him, you don't do that.
Yeah.
He's my blessing.
So it goes back to your point in terms of, God's will be done despite how we try and, game things, so to speak. Absolutely. So now let's move forward and look at 21 and 22. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each one of the sons of Joseph, bowing to worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. So very interesting to me, and I think this was kind of an aha moment I actually had today on this particular thing around Joseph and wanting his bones to be done what? Brought back to the promised land. How many years went by between him saying that and it actually happening? 100+ years. And I think about this, and this is kind of another analogy here perhaps, but how often do we settle for Egypt when God wants the promised land for us? And why do we do that? Does that make sense what I'm saying? Sometimes we just accept things when God has so much more that he wants to do for each one of us. And Joseph understood that. So now let's look at Hebrews 11:23, and now we get into the life of Moses. Yes. Yeah, much better than a bunch of bones going back to Palestine. Absolutely right, yes. So Hebrews 11:23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. So, I want to focus on Moses as we will later on, because certainly he was a man of faith. But let's focus, remember what his mama and his papa, what their names were? Amram and Jochebed. And I wrote this from Jochebed's perspective, but let's put ourselves in that moment in time. What did Jochebed know? Well, they were in slavery, weren't they? So she understood slavery. Do you think she understood oppression, hardship, brutality? You just go on and on and on. But on the positive side, what did Jochebed know? Did she know her identity? She knew God. She trusted in God. And, putting your child into a basket must have been very serious in terms of trying to protect him, but that took great faith, didn't it? If you ever watched some of those Discovery Channel things, you ever seen the Nile crocodile? Those are not small things. So even as we look at the life of Moses' parents, and I thought about this morning, not only were they the parents of Moses, but who else? Aaron and Miriam. Were they heroes of the Bible? She was a really good mom. He was a really good dad. She was a faithful mom who trusted God. So now let's move forward into the life of Moses, starting with verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he has grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch him. And I found this one really interesting on verse 29. By faith, who is it? The people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they were attempted to do so by the same, were drowned. So there's a few images that kind of come forward here. If you have a life of luxury, as Moses did the first 40 years of life, is it difficult to leave from a human point of view? Yes. And then you kind of fast forward to the next 40 years. He marries, and he comes back to Egypt, and then we see, of course, what happens with the plagues. the Exodus of Israel. And I remember watching the Ten Commandments. Remember that movie back in the late 50s, I think? Who was the actor? Charlton Heston. I just remember that magnificent flowing beard. You know, pictures like this here. And I actually found a video clip that I just couldn't get very well. It's very grainy. But, you know, the image of Moses spreading his hands, the power of God parting the waters. But in that verse, we see that by faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land. Would it have taken faith, using a human wisdom point of view, to take that first step? Yeah, it would for me. So the children of Israel, and we see all of their backslidings and all the different things for the next 40 years that, to be honest, is rather frustrating. And I always think to myself, if I was there and I see all these miracles, would I be a complaining individual? They had so many opportunities to see the power of God, and yet they were, outside of Caleb and Joshua, never did reach the promised land. So verses 30 and 31. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. So I want to focus on Rahab just for a moment. Do you find it interesting that here in the Great Faith chapter that Rahab is highlighted? You know, we just talked about Moses and his whole journey. I find it really encouraging to see examples like Rahab called out. As we go further into the book of Judges and some of the faith characters there, all of these examples, were they perfect? No, they were sinful. Big mistakes that were made, yet they were called out for having faith. And that is really encouraging for me, Rick Weaver, here in the year 2019, that happens. So Rahab for a moment. And what I think about Rahab is I want to focus on the action, is what they're calling out. Rahab shows us that, first, no matter what our past is, God can use anyone. I think of the book of James, and James also calls out Rahab in James chapter 2. Was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? So this reminds me of what is really the book of James about? The most famous thing, faith without works is dead. So this bi-directional thing that we see here, that we see the actions of Rahab illustrate the faith that she had. And again, kind of put yourself in her position. Where is she in? Not with a lot of people that know God, right? She was in Jericho. And so her and her family were really the only ones that actually were able to escape. She got that red scarlet ribbon. And through her faith, by her actions, we see that relationship between faith and works. So now we get into a whole set of individuals, verses 32 through 38. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, and Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refused to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking, there's that word again, and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep, goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. What do you think when you read that? There's a lot of trials and tribulations, aren't there? Sawn in two, killed by the sword. on in 2, yes? There's hope for all of us. Well, I want to draw attention to the first 4 names that were called that. We had Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah. These are all found in what book? The book of Judges. And so let's look at Gideon for a moment. Where was the faith of Gideon? What was the situation? The Midianites. And remember, his army was reduced and reduced and reduced to how many? 300. Well, this got me really interested. So that clearly would be a sign of faith, that God is in control. Use us for your purpose, God. Well, I went and I started looking at military underdogs, kind of historical things here. So look at these statistics right here. In the Vietnam War, there was a battle called Long Tan, and this had to do with the 6th Battalion of Australia. And there was 108 men that held off an ambush force of 1,500. So if you do the math, that's about 13 to 1 odds. Okay? There was another battle, this goes back into the 15th and the 16th century, but there's a Korean general named Yi that held off a Japanese fleet, and the numbers there were 200 ships that the Japanese had and 13 ships. So that takes us to almost 15 to 1 odds. Well, let's read Judges 7:12. Now the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number as the sand of the seashore in multitude. So let's just say, I don't know how many the sands of the sea are, or numerous as locusts are, but let's just use 120,000. The odds there are 400 to 1. So as you think about, quote, modern day military victories and the odds, there's a lot of great stories out there, but truly this was God's will. And Gideon moved in faith. Now, did he have issues? Yes. You read that he worshiped idols and things of that nature, as you read later on. Well, let's look at the next story here, which is Balak and Deborah. Barak and Deborah. Now, the story here, and this is an interesting one. I think my lesson as I studied this, and I went back to the book of Judges, is that, Barak was called to fight, but he refused to do so without Deborah. And so she was with them. And I think this is an important thing, that sometimes when we're struggling with faith, sometimes it's really good to have a friend by your side, is it not? That are walking that walk together. She was a prophetess. She would sit by a tree and judge. So I think about this particular quote. This came from Mother Teresa. I can do things you cannot. You can do things I cannot. But together we can do great things. So when I look at Barak and Deborah, I kind of put those together in terms of sometimes we do need encouragement. And us together in this room is a form of encouragement, of walking together as one mind. The next one was Samson. And boy, what do we say about Samson? Well, I tried to look at this 2 different ways. He definitely had some moral flaws, didn't he? Certainly lust was one of those. He certainly did not live up to his training as a Nazirite. And personal inclination for revenge, did you see that in his character? But on the positive side, he did accept his role. You do see glimpses of trusting faith, and there's a willingness to be used by God, and you see that at the very end there. And then the last one was the story of Jephthah. And this one, I tell you what, was one that I will tell you biblical scholars still wrestle with. Do you remember the story of Jephthah? He ended up, he made a vow. The first person that he sees coming out of his house to be offered as a sacrifice. And who was the first one that walked out of his daughter? Now, there are 2 different views of what really happened. There is the sacrificial view, that there was a human sacrifice, and you will see people argue that particular point. And there's also a dedication view. Think of Samuel being dedicated in the temple. So the sacrifice was of his daughter to permanent service of God. And, we're not going to know in terms of what exactly happened this side of heaven. But, judges do highlight the fact that, one, she was an only child. Celibacy would be the end of his family line. So, I think as I go through and study the Bible, did God approve of human sacrifice? No. Would an example like this in Hebrews 11, when we see Jephthah highlighted? I don't know. So this is one that I don't think we're going to know until we get to heaven. But, he was highlighted in the book of Hebrews as one of faith. So I want to close with the last two verses here, verses 39 and 40. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they would not be made perfect. There is a story about a fork. You probably have heard it before. Ann Landers kind of repeated this. And it had to do with a woman that was diagnosed that had a terminal illness. And as they're working through things, she said that she wanted to be buried with a fork. You heard this story before? And it goes back to the story that she loved potlucks. And you go and you eat your potluck. They take away all the dishes, but everyone said, hold on to your fork. There's something better coming. So as we read Hebrews 11, there's a lot to be inspired on related to the heroes of the Bible. They made mistakes, as we all do, but they all had that walk of faith, and that is the encouraging part for me, is that we need to save our fork. The best is yet to come. Let's bow our heads for prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we give you all the glory and the praise. We ask that we walk that walk of faith as many of these heroes of the Bible did in terms of their walk with you, Lord. Give us the strength, give us the wisdom, help us to be a light, to share the greatness that you have done for each one of us, and to share the gospel, the great news of your coming is my prayer this evening. Amen.